Mall of America. It's home to world-class shopping, great dining, and amazing attractions and events. And these are our stories, presented by Bloomington, Minnesota Travel and Tourism.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of So Much More. I'm your host, Dan Jasper, and I honestly am afraid to start. That's all I'm saying. We've been doing some talking, pre-production, pre-filming here, and the two gentlemen you're about to meet can tell so many stories, and they're hilarious that I think someday we're going to just book you for like 4 hours and have you come in and join us. Today, though, we are taking a trip back in time to 1965 when the Beatles performed their one and only Minnesota concert at Metropolitan Stadium. And for those of you who know, Metropolitan Stadium used to stand on the ground that Mall of America now occupies. So it is part of our history. And very recently, to mark the 60th anniversary of that historic night, a special celebration with WDGY and our guests were held here at Mall of America. And in just a couple of weeks, Paul McCartney is coming back to Minnesota again, which we're really excited for, a Minneapolis tour. So to help us reflect on that summer, that celebration, that concert, I have two very special guests who are going to share their stories today. I have Ron Butwin and Bob Pratt. Gentlemen, welcome. How are you?
Great, thank you. Thank you for the gentleman part.
Yes, contractually, I'm obliged to say that, but I'm so glad you're here, and I'm a little worried, but I kind of just want to say go, right? Just the way we were talking before, because their stories, it was so much fun. We'll start over here. Just kind of tell me about your involvement leading up to and the day of that concert, and then feel free to jump in whenever you can, right? And let's see how it goes.
Dan, first of all, let me just say that when it comes to information about that period, both of us are full of it.
Okay, good. I like that.
Information, I mean.
Yes, I know that. Or sure. Both. Yeah. I'm going with it.
So I was a 18-year-old musician, professional musician, had been playing for a number of years, and also worked at a store called B Sharp Music Store. And B Sharp was the store for every rock and roll musician and any kind of musician, basically, to get their equipment. It was a great store. And I was friendly with Ray Colahan, who brought the Beatles in, but ran
Reggie's Dance Land.
Yes, Reggie's Dance Land at Excelsior. And we got wind of the fact that he was getting quotes, getting numbers together to see if he could bring the Beatles in. And so another employee from the store and I were talking to Jim, the owner, Jim Lopez, who passed away just recently and had to miss the big event here a month ago. And he was telling us that he'd like to get a Rickenbacker 12-string guitar made just for Paul McCartney to give to them.
Yes.
And we got excited about that, and I thought, well, wait, I'm a young musician. I'd like to be involved in that, and I was pretty entrepreneurial, and I wanted to do that. So then we started doing more work on it, and we found that they contacted Brian Epstein and said, can we give from B Sharp Music Store this guitar?
Yep.
And Brian Epstein came back with, no, we wouldn't take it. We said, this is a handmade, this is made special. He said, no, we can't, we've made the decision not to promote a single store or a manufacturer, and so we can't do it. So I said, what if we said it's from the musicians of Minnesota?
Love it.
And they said, that's fine, because that's not a business. And so that was an okay. And then things started coming together, and us going back and forth with Ray Colahan to see if that could be done. And so then he said, let's do this at the press conference. We thought this is a perfect thing to do. And here I am, 18. I've just had a band that was called the Escapades that everyone thought we were from England. We came out we looked like a Beatles-type band. We sounded identical. We had a lead singer that could imitate Paul McCartney, and he could do John Lennon perfect. And so the group was really a good group, looked the part, we dressed the part. We come on stage, and I'd say, well, we're glad to welcome you all here this afternoon, because we're going to be doing a lot of different songs that we think you're going to enjoy, so please stay around. And so they were sold that we were
I love it.
The Beatles. And that's another story for another time. But that's what then led me to get so excited, because I was going to meet this group that was different than any group I'd ever played with. It offered a whole new sound. It gave us a chance to start our band, and our band started our very first job. We kept in hiding and get everything perfect, and we opened with Chuck Berry, and we played with Chuck Berry. So everyone thought we were from a different country, and here we are. So when this thing came up, I was all primed. I want to meet the Beatles really bad. This is a way for us to meet them, and Rickenbacker Guitar Company is willing to make this custom guitar. It was a beautiful guitar. It sounded tremendous. And the Beatles had older style Rickenbacker guitars. They didn't have this one. Yeah. And the only one that had one similar was a group called the Byrds. And it was a different color, but it was a similar type. So we got it arranged that we could give this guitar halfway through the press conference. And Bob was there at the concert, but he was a little smaller than I and a little younger than I was at that time, but he was very lucky to be there. Halfway through the concert, it was not the concert, the press conference. Yep. The Beatles, we have them on film. I have the film, the original raw footage of the film. They were bored as hell. They just, "Hi, I'm from this paper in town here. What's it like to have long hair? Next question. Tell me, how do you sleep at night with long hair?" They didn't want to know about the music. They didn't want to know about the professionalism. They didn't care about anything. And the Beatles, you can just see them going, they were just bored as hell. Yeah. All of a sudden, Bill Deal comes up. It's time now. And it's, "Well, not kids, but lads, we've got a big surprise for you tonight." And they kind of look up, and you can see it. They look up to see what's this big surprise, because they are really bored with all these questions. And they see us walking up, and we've got a guitar case. They don't know they're getting this. Yeah. And case gets opened up, and we take the guitar up to them, and they're like, oh, just like 4 kids in a candy store. They were like kids.
Because they were young.
Yeah. Yes, they were. And they were so excited. So then we're walking towards George, because that's who it's for. He's the lead guitar player. It made sense. We bring the guitar up, and he's like, "Oh, I've always wanted one of these. This is great. This is fab." And it was really exciting. I'm as excited as it can be. I didn't anticipate being this excited. Yeah. And the other guy that was with me from B Sharp, same thing. We're both very excited. And we get to shake each one's hands, and I shake George's, and he says, "I'm going to play this tonight. I'm going to play it on our next recordings. I'm going to play it." He says, "I love this." Paul has jumped up out of his seat and said, "George, let me play it for a moment. Let me try it," because he could play reversed hand. And so he says, just a minute. It's for a few minutes yet. And John is sitting there, and he's kind of smiling because it's a gift, but he doesn't see it moving down to him. Yeah. So when I shook Paul McCartney's hand, he was all excited. This is so nice that we have this in the band. He saw it as something he could play on, but it wasn't going to probably be his. When I got to John and shook his hand, he said, "Well, did you bring one for me?" And I said, "No, we're sorry, that we didn't be." Oh.
Do you remember what Ringo said?
Yeah. Yes.
Ringo said, "Don't worry about it. I don't know how to play one of those anyway." Yeah. But of course, John already had a Rickenbacker.
Yes.
He had a 6-string that he played.
And it was an older...
Yeah, from the beginning. That was one of his earliest guitars. And George already had a 12-string Rickenbacker. He was given the second 12-string Rickenbacker ever made.
Wow.
They gave the first one to a woman who I believe was a sessions musician in Nashville. And then George got the second one. And you can see that one in A Hard Day's Night. And that was the long neck string, 12-string. And that is what inspired the Byrds. David Crosby and Roger McGuinn went to see A Hard Day's Night, and they saw George playing that 12-string Rickenbacker, and they said, "We got to get one of those for the Byrds." And of course, that defined their sound, that 12-string Rickenbacker that they played. And the Rickenbacker that George played in A Hard Day's Night is the one that he played on stage at the Met in 65. It's the square body.
Really? Okay.
The crazy thing about it was when I went into the locker room to meet the Beatles, George was tuning the one that Ron had given them. And we assumed that meant he was going to play it that night on stage. But when you see the pictures of them on stage, you can clearly see that it's the square body. The one that Ron gave them was the round body.
Yep.
Why he decided not to play that guitar that night, maybe he couldn't get it tuned quickly enough.
He did have it on a stand, as I remember. On
the one that's on the stand on the stage is the square body. The round body remained in the locker room. It never made it out to the stage.
Let me just interrupt one second, because you brought up the Ringo thing. John says, "Oh, you didn't bring one for me." You know, he was and he was bummed. He was the only one that was all of a sudden bummed. He went from being happy to sad. And get to Ringo, he makes the comment that Bob was talking about. And then I turned around to him, I said, "You know, I've got to shake your hand again. I'm a drummer."
Because he's a drummer.
Yeah.
And I said, now, he wasn't the best, at that time, he wasn't the best drummer in the world, but he was the most famous drummer in the world. And he was an excellent drummer, by the way. So I said, "I want to shake your hand again." I shook his hand, and he says, "You know, you didn't happen to bring a drum kit for me, did you?" Now he smiled, and he looked at John kind of like, you know, "I'm not going to bug you for that." So that was what happened with that.
Do you remember the kid? They had kids at the press conference, myself included.
Yeah, how old were you?
I was 10.
Yep.
And they allowed some of the kids to ask questions. And like one young man asked Ringo, remember?
Yeah.
"How long have you been playing the drums?" And Ringo said, "About 6 years." And the young man said, "I started playing the drums. You inspired me to start playing the drums." And Ringo said to him, "You'll never get anywhere emulating me."
Yeah.
And everybody laughed.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Oh, I love it.
So I did the smart thing when the two of us walked off the stage, so to speak, or that area. The other guy went back into the press audience. I just went off to the side of where they were sitting and decided I'll just stand here staring at the Beatles, looking at the Beatles. Behind them was Brian Epstein. Oh, I was in heaven. I mean, I was a musician that was playing their music and and here they really are. I'm standing there watching for a while, and somebody comes up and taps me on the shoulder from behind, and then, oh boy, it's the security guard. They're going to say, "Go back out there."
Sure.
And I didn't want to turn too quick. You know, I thought, all right, he's doing it again. I turn around and he says, "Hello." And I said, "Hi, it's Brian Epstein."
Wow.
He walked over and he said, "You know, I'd like to get your phone number and your address and your name and everything, because I'm sure George would like to send you a thank you note."
Yep.
I'm stunned because it's Brian Epstein. To me, that was as important as meeting the four Beatles, because there's the brains of the outfit. And he was really nice. I wrote down the information. He says, "Oh, so, you know, I really thank you very much." And then he said, would you like to watch the concert in the dugout?" Which Bob was there. And I said, "Really? Yeah. You know, what are you going to say?" "Yeah. No, I don't really care."
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I was lucky enough to go down there after to watch the concert, which you couldn't hear much of, but it was great. A couple months later, I'm out in front of my parents' house cutting their lawn. Mailman comes up, and in those days, we all knew our mailman. You know, you talked to him firsthand. They knew what you were doing in life and whatever. And he says, "Ron, I got a letter here from London, from a Neb's Enterprises." Oh. I mean, I'd already forgotten that maybe I would get this. I opened it up, and he's standing there. He says, "Well, open it up. I want to see open it up." And it's a nice letter from George thanking me for the guitar and how much he enjoyed it. And there was the indication, if I'm ever in London, give them a call. And I wanted to see the studios. I wanted to be a part of that whole thing. A year later, I'm in London, and I call the number, and they answer from the studios, and they said, "The boys are all in the Bahamas on vacation."
Okay.
Do you think
that's probably when they were making help?
It could be.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask them, do you think they'd mind if they came back just didn't.
I love it.
So that's kind of how the story continued. Since then, every single year for 60 years, I've had this type of thing happen, interviews. I've been written up in a couple books and magazines, and been on TVs.
Do you still have the letter?
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't find it last night fast enough to bring it today, but yes, I have the letter.
They were notorious for that. There's a scene in A Hard Day's Night where they're sitting around and their two managers come in with the basket full of fan mail. They were notorious, and that was due to Brian Epstein's tutelage. Mm-hmm. They were notorious for following up with their fans as much as they possibly could. Yeah. And I had a friend who happened to meet up with George at the Leamington Motor Inn and loaned him a couple of paperback books because he had heard that George was into this particular author. And like 2 months later, he got a letter from George thanking him for, and my dad, when we first walked into the locker room, when we were invited into the locker room by Ray Crump, who was the Twins equipment manager.
Yep.
And he was kind of keeping track of the Beatles. They had the Beatles in the Twins locker room. And he was the one that invited us, my dad and I, down to meet the Beatles. And my dad immediately spotted this guy. He had this camera around his neck. And my father pointed to the camera and he said, "Do you see that camera?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "That's a Hasselblad portable portrait camera." Now, this is 1965. My dad's Nikon, which was one of the nicest cameras you could buy at the time, was about $250. This Hasselblad that was hanging around this guy's neck was $3,000, $3,000. And my dad said, "Well, this guy must be somebody special." Well, it turned out it was Robert Whittaker. It was one of their official photographers. My dad went over and introduced himself to Mr. Whittaker. They struck up a conversation, and I wasn't really paying any attention, but it was probably 3 or 4 months after the tour was over. This package arrived in the mail, again from London, and it was Mr. Whittaker had sent a picture that he had taken in the Twins locker room prior to the concert of Paul tuning his Hofner bass next to an equipment crate that said Minnesota Twins. And he sent it to my dad with a note saying, "Thought you might get a kick out of this picture."
That's great.
And I don't know. And the crazy thing about it is what I discovered years later, the only place that picture was ever published was in the 66 tour program that they sold during the Beatles' last tour. It was in the Paul section. Other than that, it had never been published anywhere. And then years later, friends of mine were like, "Well, that's the picture," because he sent a negative, and my dad we had a dark room in our home, and we would replicate the picture and give it to people. And then we discovered years later, I got a hold of Mr. Whittaker's widow, and she said, "Oh, go ahead and duplicate it as often as you'd like." But when they put the Whittaker book out, Robert Whittaker with the Beatles, the Time Life coffee table book, I said, "Put that picture in the book because nobody's ever seen it other than the people."
It's unique.
That bought the 66 tour program.
Did it get in the book?
You betcha.
Oh, neat.
Yeah.
That's nice.
For our listeners, explain, you were 10 years old, what role your dad had that got you invited to both the locker room and the press conference and the concert.
My dad started bringing pictures of the Beatles home off the wire service, UPI and United Press International and AP. It was late 1962, early 1963. He started bringing pictures home from the TV station. He said, "There's this thing going on in Great Britain, in Europe, called Beatlemania, and it's this hysteria that has apparently been created by these 4 guys that are in a rock and roll band." So I started seeing pictures of the Beatles fairly early on, before any of us in the States had any knowledge of them. And then what happened is when my father explained it to me, he goes, "Now, for all I know, these guys might be the greatest musicians in the history of music, or it might be that they were chosen for their looks, that they can't really play or sing, that they're being marketed to kids, but they're not the legitimate deal." So like everyone else in the States, the first time we ever got a chance to see them play live was February of '64 on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I was talking to Ron about this earlier in the afternoon. That night, I was at Union Congregational Church in St. Louis Park, Sunday night potluck supper, which they did every week. Yeah. And I told my parents that if we didn't get home before the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan, that I was going to run away, that I was going to disown them. And the crazy thing about it is Earl Batty, the Twins catcher, was there that night to give a speech. He went around to churches and did that. And he stood up and said, I'm going to make this short and sweet because I know all of you want to get home to see the Beatles. And I just went, thank you, Jesus. And so there we are. And my dad's got his nose up to the TV screen because he's trying to figure out if these guys are really playing or singing. And the first song that they did was All My Lovin'. And my dad turned to me and he goes, this is real. They're singing, they're playing. There's nobody behind the curtain. This is live. They're not lip syncing. These guys are the real deal. And the crazy thing about it was the second tune they did that night, my father's all-time favorite piece of entertainment, Broadway show, music, movie, soundtrack album, was a thing called The Music Man. Yeah. And the second song that the Beatles did that night was Till There Was You from The Music Man.
Really?
And I went to my dad, I went, Dad! And he goes, these guys are all right. And from that point on, my father had a very, very strong appreciation and curiosity about the Beatles. So when they came to when it was announced that they were coming to Minnesota, my dad made sure, he was the head photographer at KMSP Channel 9, and he made absolutely certain that we were going to go to the show.
So let me ask you a question. The week after that happened, did they make you go to church again or not?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
We went every Sunday. But the deal was, my dad was the photo news director at Channel 9. He was the head photographer, and he was the one that doled out all the assignments. Now, when we arrived at the press conference, every photographer at Channel 9 was there. Everybody was there. But the deal was, we went out to the airport and filmed them getting off their plane, and then we went to the press conference, and the footage that you see on YouTube of them getting off the plane and of the press conference that Ron was talking about, that's my dad's footage.
That's his footage?
Well, you can tell it's my dad's because my dad's camera was set up right in front of George. Everybody else was over to the left in front of Paul and John. But the footage that you see on YouTube is shot from that. And in the pictures, you can see me standing next to my dad's camera, and you can see my dad's camera with the Channel 9 logo on it. My dad actually designed that logo. But that's how we wound up at the press conference. And then as we were loading my dad's camera equipment into his car, we went out through the press gate, we ran into Ray Crump. And Ray Crump says to my dad, and I'll never forget it, Kenny, you and Bobby want to come down to the locker room and meet the Beatles? And I looked at my father, and my father looked at me, and he goes, well, what do you think? And I went, well, yeah.
Yes. So
the next thing I know, there we are. They're in the Twins locker room. I remember it very vividly. I shook hands with Ringo first, Paul second, John third, and George fourth. Wow. Then Mel, and all I said was, I love your music. I'm really looking forward to the show. I had kind of been mentored by my father how to talk to famous people, not to get crazy or, And so I was very matter of fact. Yep. I'm 10 years old and I'm going, oh my God, I'm shaking hands with the Beatles. And then Mal Evans, I didn't know it was Mal Evans at the time, but he was one of their two friends from Liverpool that were their quote unquote roadies, asked if I would like an autographed picture. Now, the thing you have to understand, my father had taught me this from the day I was old enough to remember. It's protocol if you're a working member of the press. You never ask for pictures. You never ask for autographs.
Ever.
And so I looked at my father, and he goes, well, if they offered, it's okay. So, again, Ringo signed it first. Paul signed it second. John signed it third. George signed it fourth, and he flipped the guitar over the 12-string Rickenbacker and laid the picture down and signed it.
Oh.
And then he handed me the photo.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that part. That's interesting.
And then the next thing I know...
So they've never been able to get those smudges off of the guitar.
I kind of ruined it, right?
Yeah,
So then that was my cue, okay, because I wasn't supposed to be there.
Yeah.
In other words, I was there with my dad, and my dad knew everybody in town, all the security people, all the cops. And so it was understood if I was there and I knew how to behave that it was okay. So I went over into a corner, sat down in front of Don Mincher's locker, just to stay out of the way while my dad was talking to the other press people in the locker room. And this guy comes over. They had 4 roll-away beds, one for each one of the Beatles, and they were kind of propped up in the back. And this guy comes over and sits down and puts his legs up and crosses his feet, and he turns to me and he goes, didn't we just meet? And I said, well, yeah, I'm Bob. And he goes, well, I'm John. And I said, well, yeah, you're John Lennon. You're in the Beatles. And he goes, oh, you've heard of me. And I said, yes, yes. And then he proceeded to ask me, he started pointing to the nameplates over the lockers.
Players.
And he pointed to this one locker and he goes, how in the world do you pronounce his name? And I said, well, that's Zoilo Versalles. He's our shortstop. And then he pointed to Harmon's locker, number 3, Harmon Killebrew, and he goes, oh, that's number 3. He's the one that hits all the home runs. And I said to him, why would you know that? And he goes, I was raised by my aunt in Liverpool. She had a neighbor who was in the Merchant Marine. He used to bring the sporting news back from the States. And as a young kid growing up in England, anything that came from America was considered to be like magic. So I would pore over the sporting news. And he said, I don't have as much time to follow baseball as I used to because I'm kind of busy being in the Beatles. Then Ringo came over and Ringo was the one that said, I think the Twins are going to win the pennant this year. And of course, John said he's forgotten more about American baseball than I know. He said there are 2 things that Ringo knows. He knows American country music and American baseball. And that was the magic summer of '65 at the Met. We had the All-Star Game, the Beatles, and the World Series in the same summer. Ringo's prediction came true.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
You're going to hate me for saying this. Our audience is going to hate me. We're almost out of time with
How's
this
that
show.
possible?
I know, and we're going to. What I'd love to do is invite you back again. If you'd be willing to come back again, I would love to have you. But I'd love a very quick story from both of you. What the concert was like from your perspective. You were both there in the dugout.
Well, the lucky thing for both of us is we were between all the screamers and the band. If anybody was going to hear it, we were going to hear it.
Because they were behind you.
They were behind us. But all I remember is that it was very obvious that the only mic on Ringo was his vocal mic. The drums were not mic'd. So you couldn't, from where we were, but you could hear their vocals just as plain as day, and you could hear how spot on perfect the harmonies were. And of course, Ron would know better than I, because Ron being a professional musician, but they were doing this without monitors on stage, and they were doing this in front of 25,000 screaming people. The fact that they were that perfect, that without the advantage, the technical advantages that musicians have now, to me, is just a miracle.
They were younger,
yeah,
so they had the ability to. They were screaming out. Even then, they were singing. As a performer, I didn't like seeing them sound like that. In other words, you're right. You could hear them. There was so much noise, and it easily could have drowned. We knew that it drowned out everybody in the stadium, but it was like, oh, these guys are too good to have to put up with bad speakers, and nobody out there is hearing it. We are
and appreciating it.
Yeah, they're not
in the
getting
perspective that we didn't have at the time. Maybe Ron did because he was a little older and he was a professional musician. But I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
What I learned later is they'd been doing this for 3 years. For them, this was like falling off a log.
Just another. Yeah.
They could do it by memory, by rote.
Yeah.
That's how. And I remember when I saw them on Sullivan, I thought, this is too perfect to be true, to be real. Well, what I didn't realize is just because we were seeing them for the first time, this wasn't the first time they were doing it. They were seasoned professionals by then.
They say that you have to do something 10,000 times to be automatic with it. They had done their 10,000 times with their stuff. The one thing was that stayed with me. I was already playing their music. We were coming across my band as not the Beatles, but a Beatles English type group.
Yep.
And I was sitting there and I was thinking, oh my God, this is the future. This is not Chuck Berry of the past. This is not all this Jerry Lee Lewis and that kind of. This is a whole new thing that we didn't know what to do with it. I mean, we knew what to do with it, but it was like so exciting. I remember I left the stadium that day. First of all, I was thanking Brian Epstein and thanking everybody. I was so excited. I drove home. All I could tell you was how excited I was to come back and tell the band members, this is not going to be an overnight thing. This is unbelievable. We got to really mentally put ourselves into this even more. And it changed my life as far as rock and roll went. I didn't care about all the local bands that were in town were trying to figure out who we were, why we were in town and stayed there to play some more jobs. And they were starting to learn English songs. But I'm thinking, they weren't there. They didn't realize, well, some were there at the concert. They didn't realize that this was going to change music forever.
And see, Ron was old enough, and he was a professional musician. I was 10 years old, and I remember my father saying this. He goes, these guys might go down as the most important phenomenon in the history of popular music, or 6 months from now, we might have completely and totally forgotten about them. And that's the thing. If I had realized at the time who I was in the presence of, who I was meeting and what I was looking at, I probably wouldn't have had the poise to behave the way that I did. But at the time, it was just, well, these are four guys, four mere mortals, and who knows? I don't think at the time the Beatles could have even imagined what they would eventually become. But they were already, on their way. I was talking to Ron about this afternoon.
Yeah.
I had the British version of the album A Hard Day's Night, and that was kind of the turning point in terms of their writing. And as kids, it was obvious all the adults at the press conference thought these guys were a joke. But we knew back then that this was something special.
The real deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Next time, maybe we can ask you where you were in 1965
I would be glad to do that. And I am hoping to get you back on if you're willing to come back again, because I think there's a lot more we can dive into. Besides, your backgrounds are so amazing. We haven't even touched on that. But I want to thank you. I was only 5, by the way, in 1965.
Did you live in Minnesota?
I did at the time, yes.
Where?
Yes. Fridley, I think, is probably where we were at that time.
Okay.
So I don't remember any of this. But what I do want to do is, I think this is the first podcast I've hosted where I don't think I asked a question, where my guest just went, and I loved it. Your stories are amazing.
Well, that's fun then.
And what
good.
I loved about this was seeing these 4 young men, who I think of as these icons, as good young men, right? And just the thank you letters and everything, the willingness to meet with you and take a photo. And
when I introduced my dad to John, because my dad came over, and I spent about 15 minutes talking to John, just one-on-one. And when my dad came over, I introduced my dad. I said, Dad, this is John Lennon. John, this is my dad, Ken Pratt. And John turned to my father and said, you have a very, very polite young son. You should be very proud of him. And earlier in the conversation, when I was pointing out the various ball players' names, he said, son, you seem to know a lot about the Beatles, or about the ball players. Yeah. And right then, a little light went off in my head, because in the movie A Hard Day's Night, he referred to Ringo as son. He would say, son, don't be so. And I thought to myself, oh, they were just playing themselves in the movie, because he was talking just like he had in the film. And I thought, I just assumed that was all scripted and it was all acting. And it was like, no, they were just basically told to be themselves. And like I said, when I think back on it, it's like, here's this guy, one of the, an icon already, and he's taken the time to talk to this 10-year-old kid just like he's a regular person.
Taking the time for a 10-year-old, taking the time for an 18-year-old musician. This brings new light, the Beatles to new light to me, and I'm excited that we can share this story.
Good.
I want to thank both of you, Bob, Ron, thank you so much. We want to thank WDGY, who recently hosted an amazing event at Mall of America, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the concert of the Beatles. And like I said, in a couple weeks, one of them is going to be here playing again, which we're excited about. But this is an open invitation. I want to have you both back on if you'd be willing to do that.
Be glad to.
And for all of our listeners, for all of our watchers, please watch, subscribe, tell all of your Beatle fan friends about this, because this is amazing, and we want to thank you so much for joining us today on So Much More.
Thanks for listening to So Much More, a Mall of America podcast. Subscribe wherever you find your favorite podcasts. This show is presented by Bloomington, Minnesota Travel and Tourism.